Today I'm going to jump all around the place like a cat on a tin roof. I'm really going to cover a whole stack of things relative to SMSFs and various issues that come up. Now we're going to talk about these couple of people here. Random names, Brad and Angelina. They're married with a couple of kids, Justin and Chloe. Together they own Smith Proprietary Limited, which is a small business of indeterminate function. They've each got 100 grand, all taxable in their fund. They're individual trustees. When the fund was established, they each rolled in the balances of their retail funds. They've been contributing 25 grand per annum each, and the major benefit or the major asset they've got in there is a big life insurance cover, a couple of $1 million each. Own occupation and TPD. They both have current wills. Each is nominated as the other's executor. Well, we're going to kill Brad off straight away. No mucking around here. You like those books that you read the first 5 or 10 pages which do the product development of this person who's just getting interesting and he drops dead, you know, that sort of thing. Just makes you go a little bit rank. But anyhow, bit of a nasty forklift accident. Brad is dead. He's 31 years of age. So, what's the trustee problem that we've got firstly with the fund? You've got a situation with individual trustees which you're going to have to fix. And, as is my want, I'll now completely digress from this, because you have to fix this trustee problem within a certain level of amount of time and in a certain way. The problem you've got is, of course, that you have individual trustees, and with individual trustees you need 2 trustees if you've got a single member fund. Now this fund isn't yet a single member fund because you've got the dead guy's account, Brad's account, he's still there. But you've got to appoint someone as a legal personal representative for Brad, and that's got to be done within 6 months. Now, it's not necessarily within 6 months, but it should be. And that brings me to discuss just for a moment a case which is no doubt second nature to a lot of you, and you'll sigh and say, not this one again, but good old Katz and Crosman. Is there anyone here who doesn't know the Katz and Crosman case? Let there be one. Yes, we got one. Excellent. And a few more than I'm not going to admit. But what happens, we got Brad, he puts in place a binding death benefit nomination. Now what might that look like? As you know, binding death benefit nominations, section 5859 of the Act, require that they be written in a certain way. A couple of arm's length witnesses and a 3-year term. Now with self-managed super funds, they can issue binding death benefit nominations so long as the trust deed says so, but be careful what the trust deed says in this regard. Because the sort of binding death benefit nomination that a self-managed super fund can provide is one that's far more flexible than what you'll get out of an industry fund or retail fund. Far more flexible because you can add in a lot more conditions. Not just in the event of my death I want it to go there, and in the event that that person predeceases me I want it to go there. I know we have the issue of whether or not it's 3-year renewable or permanent, but some industry retail funds can do permanent anyhow, but what they can't do is the flexibility you can have in an SMSF. So we might have something that looks like this. Brad to Angelina, but if predeceased, then to both kids in equal shares, and if under 25, must be a non-commutable benefit restricted pension. But the kids have 3 months to unanimously determine that benefits will not be equal, taking into account the equalisation clause in the will if one exists. Now, I'm sure that that's clear to everyone exactly what that means. Certainly it's not clear to me. No, it is. What you have here is the ability to put in some conditions. You take, for example, my case. Now, I've cleverly, for estate planning purposes, got 2 of my 4 kids to move back home. And furthermore, not to stop there, I've got them to bring their sons as well. So I've now got 2 kids and 2 grandsons at home with the wife and I. I started off with 4, I still got 4. You never know, the other 2, they haven't moved back yet. They're out there breeding, getting a bit bigger before they can come back and make it a block of flats. But how clever was that for estate planning? Because when you think of it, you've got a situation where if I die and my wife has predeceased me, and because, you know, my clearly very young age, those of you who wonder about that, well, clearly I've had a hard life. You didn't get a body like this by accident. It took years of abuse. What happens is that if I had a binding death benefit nomination, which was a sort of standard thing, which says everything to the wife, if she predeceases me, then to the kids in equal shares, I've basically given them a tax problem. And I see this with a lot of binding death benefit nominations that are put in place that are quite severe and restricted. So what I would say is, in the event that my wife predeceases me, the money can go to my kids equally. They can't take a pension, unlike with Brad and Angelina, so I won't include that. Unless the kids, within the death benefit period, decide unanimously to take it in some other way. Because really, I've got a situation where my 4 kids could get together and say, okay, we'll pay everything from the fund to the 2 that are living with me that I've cleverly got back in order to get around the tax problem. I've turned them into tax dependents, given that they are an interdependency relationship now, so they can get all the money tax-free. Of course, they can then keep it. So it'll be necessary for the others and them to get together and determine that there's going to be some sharing, because as you know, kids never think about the money. But anyhow, if we didn't do that, and if they can't come to agreement, okay, well then they've got the tax impost. But given that there's an equalisation clause in the will, why cement a situation where 2 of them are going to have 15% tax levied against them, and even if there is an equalisation clause, the only winner there is the tax office. But in this case, you've got a situation where you've got the kids, so you might want to give them a pension which is non-commutable, which is only going to be paid out at the minimum amount, or maybe 10% maximum, or some situation like that, until the latest possible moment that it's got to be paid out. Now, once the kids get old enough, they can become members. And as members, they can become trustees. And as trustees, they may decide then, at they're 18, now vests, they can do what they like. You might want to take it a bit longer than that. You can actually do that, provided that they don't have a statutory requirement to pay it out. So if they're still living at home, whatever home might happen to be at that stage, or they're still being financially supported, where they really don't have to take the money out until they're 25, you can delay it a bit more by putting another couple of conditions in there. You might say that this pension is only commutable if you have 100% agreement of the trustees. Now, as a trustee, you might have in there an uncle, an aunt. Now, they might be appointed anyhow as the legal personal representative of the kid, because mum and dad are both dead, for example. That's not going to be useful if it's only like that, because when the kid turns 18, they're going to be sacked and the kid's going to take the position. But if they also get to put in a member balance, well, then they are members. So there are devices, there are things you can do, there are plans you can put together so as to keep the money in there as long as possible if you've got that sort of situation with the kids, as may well be the case here with Brad and Angelina. The problem is, though, some deeds have done a very poor job of stating what you can do with your binding death benefit nominations. When you set up these funds in the first place, don't just say, okay, mum and dad, there you go, sign there, bang, bang, done, finished. You really should do that fact find, and indeed you're legally obligated to do so anyhow, but you should then structure your fund and your binding death benefit nominations, if you want to use them, in a way which shores up the power of whoever it is who's going to be in charge of administering whatever the dead guy wants, or the dead lady wants. Now that's going to be a lot easier if you've got people involved who are naturally agreeable to what's intended. You put people in a place where they're going to be hostile, they might find ways around it. You've got a situation there where Helga was hostile. All she had to do was challenge the binding death benefit nomination, and if your binding death benefit nomination is not valid, it's like there's none. You then have trustee discretion. There are various ways that you can control these things, and I think that you should use them all. Don't say, well, you've done a binding death benefit nomination, that's enough. You need to bear in mind another couple of things. For example, people do have some trust deeds that have voting powers related to the member account balance. Is that effective? Maybe. But if you have individual trustees and you don't have a unanimous decision, you have a stalemate. That is no decision. It's not majority rules with individual trustees. So if you've got such a situation where you expect a stoush and you want the majority to rule, you have a corporate trustee. Because your corporate trustee, it's the weight of votes in whichever way those votes are determined. They might be by various classes of shares. They might be by the member account balance if you've got that in your constitution, because whatever you've got in your constitution will override the deed conditions in terms of voting powers. You might even do something like this. I've had several funds where you've got mum or dad, one of them with the majority of the fund and the vast majority of the fund, with a requirement to leave that to their kids from the previous marriage. Well, instead of setting up the fund, as people often do, with automatically putting mum and dad as the directors and the shareholders, only have them as directors. One of them you can put in as the shareholder, all the shares. There's no nexus, there's no need to have shares for the members. Members have to be directors or trustees or vice versa, but corporate trustee shareholders can be anyone. The one who has the lion's share of the money, and if you've got a situation where you want it to go to the kids from the previous marriage, put the shares all in that person's name in joint tenancy with the kids. Then you have a situation where on death they automatically take over the trusteeship. And if the worst comes to the worst and binding death benefit nominations don't look like they're going to work, or they're going to be challenged or this and that, they can have a meeting and sack the other person, the remaining parent, as a director, and therefore they have to get out of the fund. I mean, you can take these matters into account when you first start to make sure that you keep that level of control on more than one basis. So what'll happen here? A pension will be paid to Angelina, and what's the pension's tax status? Well, we look at that. Does she have to draw the pension? Because it's left to her. She wants to draw a lump sum. What do we need to consider? Now, within pensions, we have to look at this whole issue of reversionary, and frankly, there's been a lot of hype on this, which I find annoying, which I shouldn't, because here I am hyping away. But it's annoying if someone else does it. Now, what happens here is that people are saying you've all got to have these reversionary pensions, otherwise they stop. Well, what is the power of a reversionary pension? Yes, it continues on to the reversionary beneficiary as if the person never died. But at least in that financial year, the next financial year, the minimums are going to be based on the age of the new person, but it just continues. And a lot of people are concerned about the fact that if the pension stops, the fund is then in accumulation stage and they want to have that reversionary. A lot of people are going to the trouble of actually stopping the pension, making it reversionary and restarting. You don't need to do that. The tax office have said that if you have a binding death benefit nomination in place, which is severe, that is, there is no choice in the matter, such that there has to be a continuation of that pension to an eligible beneficiary, that will have the same standing as a reversionary pension, and it'll just continue in that regard. But then you have other people, like my esteemed friend Daniel Butler, lawyer in Melbourne, who says that as far as he's concerned, the binding death benefit nominations, if they are contrary to the reversionary beneficiary, actually override the reversionary beneficiary. So you need to be careful to see what deed you've got there and what power it gives to reversionary beneficiary, whether or not that is going to override a binding death benefit nomination if it's contrary to that. Is that a matter that you really should come across? Well, in some respect, not really. Because you shouldn't do something in your fund where you've got both a reversionary beneficiary and a binding death benefit nomination, which is in conflict. After all, you're doing them both. But where you need to be careful is this. You might have a situation where you have put a reversionary pension in place and you've left the balance of the account for this member as a non-reversionary pension. And you might say, okay, the reversionary is looked after because that's going to go to the spouse. And in order to deal with the non-reversionary, we put in a binding death benefit nomination in place and says that the member's account balance is going to go to the kids. The problem with that is that if the kids are of a school which says the binding death benefit nomination overrides the reversionary pension, they can say, hold on, mum or dad's account actually includes that reversionary pension as well, and then you've got a stoush. So just make sure that when you're doing documents which could be considered as contrary to each other, just draft them properly so you don't have those sorts of uncertainty. So what's the pension's tax status? How do we do that? As you know, lump sums are tax-free to dependents, but pensions from a death benefit arrangement, a death benefit benefit, will have a tax position which will depend on the older of the two parties. In this case, because Brad was 31, Angelina's 30, she can get a taxable pension which is fully rebatable. Now, it wouldn't be rebatable if it wasn't a death benefit pension. On the other hand, any lump sum that she takes is tax-free from the taxable component. And this is where you need to be cognizant of the death benefit period. It's only tax-free whilst it's within the death benefit period. If it's after the death benefit period, she's going to have to pay tax on the taxable component. What is the death benefit period? It's generally 6 months from the date of death or 3 months from the grant of probate, or some extended time frame if necessary. So really, notwithstanding that, you know, she's the grieving widow, if she wants to take out some money like that $500,000, she'd better do it within this time frame, or she's going to be up for tax. The life insurance premium for Brad was $970 and Angelina $830. So they got a $2 million life cover there. Pretty cheap, huh? Jesus. Tax deduction for combined life and TPD. If there's any occupation definition, 100%. If there's own occupation on the TPD, 80%, or 67% if it's standalone, which you'd hardly ever get. So your own occupation, 80%. That came about because the definition for total and permanent disablement under the SIS Act is not own occupation, it's any occupation. But it's not as bad as you might think. When they changed this, a couple of years back, they also changed the definition of any occupation, and now to get a release under TPD from an SMSF or from a super fund, you have to have 2 medical practitioners, one of which is a specialist, that certifies that you are unlikely, not that you will never, but you are unlikely to again participate in any employment. So effectively, you've got a little bit of wiggle room there. Anyhow, Angelina wants to consider any tax deductions a fund can take by way of anti-detriment and future service benefit. So let's have a look at that. What is an anti-detriment payment? An anti-detriment payment is a payment that Mr. Keating dreamt up in order to compensate you for the extra tax that he brought in. Mr. Keating, full-time Prime Minister, part-time pig farmer, he said, hey fellas, we're giving you the opportunity to get tax deductions for your contributions to super, but we're not taking any contributions tax. What we're doing is we're waiting until you withdraw something, and then when you're hitting with 30%, that's no good. We want to increase our cash flow. So what we'll change this. If you take a tax deduction, you give us 15% contributions tax, and in exchange, we'll knock the tax down to 15% at the end. And someone came up and said, hey, Paul, that's a great idea, but what about the person who dies in the middle, who's paid the 15%, and now is not going to get the benefit of what they would otherwise have had if they didn't have to pay the 15% in the first place? So Paul, in his wisdom, said, we'll have this anti-detriment payment. But he wasn't thinking much of SMSFs when he did it, because it's pretty difficult for SMSFs. What it means is this. This is not precisely correct for the pedants amongst you, but it's close enough for the purpose. If you've made a $100,000 tax deductible contribution to this fund over how many years, since 1988, that means you would have paid $15,000 in tax, right? If now, on the death of the member, you pay an anti-detriment payment equivalent to $15,000, then that will give you a $100,000 tax deduction to the fund, which enables the fund to recoup that $15,000. Now that works well for industry funds, for retail funds, because they've got big tax reserves from lots of members and they can just pay that and just reduce their tax in that year. But quite often you've got with an SMSF an inability to get the benefit of the full tax relief in the same year. So generally with a self-managed super fund, you will take this tax loss and carry it forward. But to get it, you've got to make a lump sum payment of $15,000, and you've got to make that lump sum payment from somewhere other than the dead guy's account. Where are you going to get it from? Thin air. Well, look at that. But that lump sum payment has to be the exact amount that you calculate. So, for example, in an SMSF environment, you might say, hey, we can make this payment, but we can't make it to the extent necessary. Don't do it at all. You make it for everything, or you make it for nothing. The requirements to satisfy an anti-detriment payment in this particular case, given that he's only got $2,100,000 in there and $2 million of it is life insurance for which we have taken a tax deduction, he's only got $100,000 there. And when you apply this calculation, it says that the anti-detriment payment has got to be $17,647 precisely, and that will give a deduction to the fund of $117,000. You'd probably never do it, would you? Because immediately what springs to your mind is that in order to get that, there's got to be a lump sum paid. And in order to get the lump sum out of $100,000, you're going to have to pay $2.1 million. So it's not going to happen. You're not going to have a situation where the anti-detriment is going to be suitable in this case at this age. But Angelina, she wants to take a lump sum of $500,000. She wants to take that out to pay off the house, get herself a new car, have the 3-day wake. Life insurance proceeds are excluded from the anti-detriment payment, so if she's only taken off $500,000, you're going to have to look at what proportion of that $500,000 contains the $100,000. And that's the proportion, which means you've got an anti-detriment payment of a lousy $4,202. Is it worthwhile doing? Probably not. It's going to give you a deduction of $28,000. We're talking chicken feed here. And the only reason I'm bringing this up is because I don't have to go through all this theory again later on down the track when we're looking at some real numbers. Anti-detriment at younger ages generally going to be pretty low. What about the caps? The anti-detriment payments are often mentioned. They're just a bit sexy to talk about them, so everyone does. They generally forget a fairly important little thing. And that is, A, you've got to find them from somewhere, and B, they're probably going to be counted against the deceased's concessional caps. So what happens is if you can find them from fund reserves, but most funds don't have fund reserves. But perhaps you build them up simply for this purpose. And there are ways of building them up. You might get it from insurance proceeds. If you get them from insurance proceeds, they'll go to the reserve. And either way, the tax office will regard them as being counted against the concessional caps. So when you've got, as you may have, $100,000 allowable anti-detriment payment, that might have been okay a few years ago, where $100,000 was the deductible amount, but now we're down to a lousy 25. You can have quite a significant breach of the caps. And that brings forward another little nasty. You've got someone who's appointed as executor of the estate. They pay out everything, including the benefits, and they sit back smugly because they've now done a good job. But because they made an anti-detriment payment when they were as the LPR of the fund, or because the trustees have, or because anyone has, the tax office comes back with a cap breach bill. No more money left because the executors paid it all out, so they become personally liable. So be very, very careful on that one. It can be a nasty little surprise and probably spoil someone's whole day. But quite apart from finding the anti-detriment payment that way, you can do it another way. You can use this thing called a future income tax benefit. Now, a future income tax benefit is a payment by the fund, so clearly it's going to be sourced from the capital that other members have, a payment by the fund for a future income tax benefit. And that future income tax benefit is the tax deduction. Now, that is not regarded as coming from a reserve. I must say, I find this too good to be true, but the fact is, done it many times, and the ATO think it's fine. And if the ATO think it's fine, I'm in agreement with the ATO. Lovely people. And that situation, you are not taking a withdrawal for members' minimum benefits, because you're not allowed to do that. You're merely making a fund payment. So that's your anti-detriment payment. And your anti-detriment payment is one, as I said, that's not that effective when you're young. So in this case, probably wouldn't use it. But have a look at this other one. The future service deduction, otherwise sometimes known as self-insurance, which I don't like, and sometimes known as the alternative method of claiming a tax deduction for insurance premiums, which is the short name, only because you say it fast. This one is a little beauty for younger people, and it's hardly ever used, even where it can be, because most people, certainly most accountants, not having a go at them, but they don't know that it exists, and therefore it doesn't happen. So here, if you've got someone who dies or becomes TPD'd, or even temporarily disabled, or has a terminal illness benefit, the fund can claim a very substantial, in many cases, tax deduction simply by virtue of the case that this has happened. Not like with an anti-detriment where you actually got to find money to pay and that sort of stuff. The only thing is that whatever happens there in A, B, C and D has got to cause a cessation of employment. For that reason, it's generally applicable only to people up to age 65, though it can be more if they have a contract of employment, which takes them past there. Whereas an anti-detriment is available at any age, future service not so. And the other thing with future service is that you calculate this amount which you must decide to take instead of a deduction for life insurance premiums. So what does that mean? Do you need to hold an insurance policy? Maybe you do. The tax officer's view is you do. In this case, they have an insurance policy. But there are many funds out there that don't. And a person dies, no insurance. Can they still take a future service deduction? Not without having insurance. We can actually, at this stage, create insurance. And we can do so by using a self-insurance reserve. A self-insurance reserve is an interesting little gadget. What happens is that, firstly, you must have a reserve. And reserves can be created by, well, a technical process, I suppose, which I called skimming off the top. At one stage, I owned a couple of nightclubs, so it's a sort of term which I've come to like. You skim off the top, it goes into the reserve. So you might take a certain amount of the returns, right? So you have a reserve, you've now got some money in it. When you've got money in it, then you rush off to your friendly actuary and you say, guys, I want to self-insure. Here's the sum insured. It's the amount they've got in reserves. That amount is the sum insured. And here are the people who are going to be insured. Here's all the members. Here's their dates of birth. Here's their genders. This is a smoker. That's not a smoker. This is what they do. And I want a policy which, if the first one gets the lot, first one's laughing. First one to claim gets the whole pot. And I want death, TPD, maybe even temporary, whatever. The actuary comes back with a number. That's your premium. Effectively, that premium can be paid by the other members of the fund into the self-insurance reserve, and the fund can take a tax deduction for it, which sounds too good to be true, doesn't it? Given that you've got to pay for the actuarial certificate, it's perhaps not something that you do as a tax play, but if you need to have an insurance policy so that you can use the future service deduction, it's pretty handy. Having said that, I understand the whispers are coming out of my friends at the ATO that self-insurance reserves are likely to be knocked on the head in the not too distant future. Of course, the not too distant future could still be a long time, but you can understand that it does not sort of seem like it satisfies the vibe, in which case you will need to have an actual life insurance policy. Angelina is killed in a tragic ballooning accident. What the hell? Brad had his turn. She was only 60. Brad had the flu that day, so he couldn't fly. Poor. She's got a member balance of $1.2 million, 450 of it which is tax exempt, because she started to do that superannuation interest type recontribution strategy. Let's have a look firstly at her potential future service deduction. It's 153 grand at her age. But can she have the future service deduction? Certainly she's young enough, but she doesn't have a life insurance, does she? But she will if we do a self-insurance reserve. So it's possible. Potential anti-detriment payment is, of course, much bigger because of her age. Giving a deduction of 880 grand, hey, that's a decent deduction to have in there. Even if Brad doesn't use it, the kids wouldn't mind it. It's worth real money. So we can do it, but we can do it if we pay the amounts out that are necessary, and we can do it because what would happen to her account? Well, it's going to go to Brad, but Brad can take out as much as he likes as a lump sum, and he's able to pay the anti-detriment payment from a future income tax benefit using his own balance, if he wishes. So the fund can have a whopping great big tax deduction going forward, and we discussed what happens in terms of that fund continuing with the pension, and that's a matter that would have to be looked at. But the fund still has individual trustees, and you've got a situation where you've got to do something about that. And that's always an interesting argument. I've had many situations where dad's died, mum's left, and inevitably we have the conversation. Mum, you're individual trustees, dad's dead, but we say this in a caring and sensitive way. And we've got to either put in a second individual trustee in now, or you've got to have a corporate trustee with you as the only director. Mum says, no, I'll go the individual trustees. Little Susie, she's savvy about this stuff, she'll help out. Who's little Susie? She's my daughter. How many kids you got? 3. Okay. You realise that when little Susie helps out, she's also got powers. And in the event of your death, which will happen eventually, she's now in a position where she can, well, have a lot to say on what happens with the fund proceeds. Do you think there could be any problem there between her and her siblings? Not a chance. My kids never worry about the money. Okay. What about her brother and sister? Do you think that there'll be a certain tension at the family gatherings whilst they look at her thinking, I wonder what she might get that, or he's getting, that we're not, because she's on your $2 million fund and we're not? Not a chance. My kids don't think about the money. What about their spouses? They do. Okay, so that we can deal with those nasty spouses, let's put a corporate trustee in place now with you as the only director. Yeah, let's do that. I have 100% hit rate on that one. Except once I got done because she said, I only have one child, my daughter, who's a solicitor. My God. You think that engineers and school teachers are a problem. This lady drove me fair rank. Angelina was concerned that her estate may be diluted before Brad's death, should Brad remarry or spend up big. So her binding death benefit nomination states that her account can only be used to pay a non-commutable death benefit pension to Brad for the statutory minimum yearly percentage. So she's going to make sure that he doesn't spend up big. She wants to keep the corpus there in the account. Also, it's non-commutable, so he can't take it out. The remaining balance must be paid to his estate, and he does binding death benefit nomination as well, and they do irrevocable wills, and all that nice paperwork is put in place to make sure that this happens, so that after he dies, everything will go equally to Justin and Chloe via testamentary trusts. Now, there are a number of SMSF specialist arrangements out there who put together very convoluted arrangements which purport to be able to do this. The problem that I have is it's a bit like a Clayton solution in that This will work, provided that everyone involved wants it to work. And it won't work if there is a concerted effort to attack it. On what basis could it be attacked? After Angelina's dead, Brad wants to get out of this arrangement. Well, really, there's a number of legal recourses he can take. One is that there is a prohibition in the Act for trustee discretion to be fettered. Maybe you can have a go on that. Maybe not. Maybe you can just ignore it. Who's going to fight if the kids don't know about it? Maybe. But let's say that all those things are well and truly tied up. He decides to move overseas. He decides to do so permanently. He can always change his mind later, can't he? That means he's got to satisfy his prudential responsibilities, just like Linda Crosman had to. He's got to roll his money over to a small APRA fund, be it a retail fund or one or the other, doesn't matter. It's now under APRA. What happens to all these binding death benefit nominations? What's happened to these pensions? Wiped. How easy was that to do? Now he can do what he likes. So I don't really think that all of these devices that are put together to achieve this end are very effective at all, if there is a concerted effort to knock them out.